All right, everyone, thank you for coming and good afternoon. My name is Mara Martinson and I work with Minneapolis Public Schools. And today we're going to be looking at the process that I use for TVM, the Teacher Verified Model. I want to give a big shout out of thanks to the program that I work with Minneapolis Public Schools. A lot of the things that we'll be seeing today are kind of an established process that was set up by them to kind of help support me with this process. And also a big shout out to all of our really awesome teachers, because as an instructional coach, I get to pop around into different classes and see some of the things that are working and hear some of those challenges and adapt. And so I'm going to bring some of the things that we've learned this year and what it looks like in Minneapolis Public Schools. So to kind of start off with, this is the plan for today, is we're just going to do a walkthrough for a method for creating and sharing TVM lessons, aligning TVM lessons to course content, administering and providing feedback on TVM lessons, and then finally tracking completion and attendance. If you are verified, you may have received a message about the instruction component of TVM lessons starting on May 1st being required to be asynchronous as a part of that TVM lesson, meaning it wouldn't be a lesson that you are giving in class and then having them complete the practice and assessment components on their own, but rather the entire package. And for our purposes today, that shouldn't be problematic because that's the approach that we've already been using with Minneapolis Public Schools. So hopefully if you've gotten stuck at that point or are thinking about that and moving forward starting in May, this might be one more thing to kind of help you out with that process. A few disclaimers, pardon the mess. Some of the slides, I tried to grab a few different screenshots of some of the things that we're working on. So sometimes the mess is me and sometimes the mess is the slides, but hopefully it'll all kind of make sense as we talk through it. And then also just to be aware that this year I'm currently teaching some of our most beginning level ELL classes. So the content that you're going to see in these lessons are mostly beginning level content with a lot of modifications needed for beginning level learners to be able to do it, including some visual exit directions and explicit instructions in multiple modalities. As we're looking at these ones, one of the things I try to tell people as an instructional coach is sometimes when you're planning for those most beginning level learners, those accommodations that we're making can be really beneficial with all the challenges with technology and content, and without that direct teacher support in the room one-on-one. Also, just to be aware of, again, the things that we're going to be looking at today, a lot of the process that I'm using is specific because of state requirements. So we're going to see that process as I was trained in, but it's also some of the things that we're going to see are specific to the program with Minneapolis Public Schools. And that's really because we're a pretty large program. And when we want to get the most bang for our buck, we want to make sure that if we're creating a TVM lesson and having that approved and aligned with our curriculum, then we want to make sure that other TVM teachers are able to kind of grab it and use it in their future lessons. So that's one thing to keep in mind as far as the tracking process. Each program might do it a little bit differently. And then also because we're with Minneapolis Public Schools and Schoology is our platform for both online and TVM lessons. So a lot of the examples we're going to see are in Schoology with a little bit of a discussion on modifications you can use if you do not use that same platform. I'm going to be kind of going through some examples in my modeling of TVM, but if you have questions or ideas that have been working really well for you, I welcome you to pop that information in the slides, and I will have certain point breaks on different slides, different sections where I'll happily check in so we can kind of share out. And again, if you have some ideas that you're excited to share, we're all learning this year. I will happily give a little time to anyone who wants to share some of those ideas out. All right, so jumping right in, every time I am working through a TVM lesson, I pull up this same document that I created at the very beginning of the year. And what this really does is it kind of keeps my process organized and clear for me as I am moving through and building that lesson. So as you can see, the steps that I do is I have building a lesson, submitting it to the state, submitting it to my program, entering my attendance, and then entering it into SID. And then down below, I have my benchmarks for the class that I'm currently teaching. Because our benchmarks in our program are aligned with a CCRS, and those are going to be questions that come up as I'm looking at that state form. I want to make sure I have that information and that alignment clear and easily accessible to kind of expedite that process. I have found this year the record keeping for my TVM lessons to be one of the greatest challenges. So I just wanted to have a place where I could keep it neat and somewhere that I can access all of that information pretty quickly. So for the first section, I'm going to walk us through steps 1, 2, and 3, how I build a lesson, how I submit it to the state, and how I submit it to my program to make sure that, again, any of the work that I have done has been accessible to anybody else in my program who is TVM trained. All right. If anyone is familiar with Schoology, this will probably look pretty familiar to you, but this is just the first step that I use when I'm creating my TVM lessons. And I have a brief video here to kind of show you how I walk through that process. So when I'm creating my TVM lessons, I create it within a shared resource folder. That way, again, anyone in my program and within Minneapolis Public Schools will be able to see those same resources. And then we have an organization system. So once I get into my low-level ELL group, I enter into that TVM folder. I enter my class name, my unit theme, and then I use the same naming protocol when I submit to the state as when I am building my lessons. And that way I can, again, make sure that once we know it's been submitted and approved by the state, that teachers can find that same name and that same amount of information. And it will also make it, because this year has been a pilot for us, easier for us to go back and kind of track if I entered it and I thought it would take X amount of time, but realized my students were spending more or less. It makes it a pretty quick and easy process to go back and change those things. So just to kind of walk through what that looks like and how I make sure that's organized and shareable with the others in my program, I made a quick video with a screencast. So I'll be quiet and hand it over to my past self for a moment.
Today, we're going to look at creating TVM lessons in the resources section of Schoology in order to make sure that your colleagues can use the same TVM lessons for future classes. To begin with, you want to make sure you're in the resources, not within your own specific course. When you're in those resources, then you can make sure that you are sharing this information with those in your program. Then choose the folder that is shared with your colleagues and make sure there's a designated folder for TVM lessons. Once you're in those TVM lessons, you can be able to find the folder for your class. I'm going to go into ELL 1. And once you're in there, you can enter the correct folder for the unit that you're working on in class. For this example, we'll look at Unit 2, School. Once you're in there, you just go ahead and add resources. Today, we'll be looking at adding assessments for our TVM lesson. And once you add that assessment, make sure that you're following the proper naming protocol that you use when you submit to the state and you share with your colleagues at work. So again, you add resources, add assessment, Enter the name, and choose the maximum amount of points that you want allotted for this assignment. Once you're in there, you're ready to start creating your lesson, and it will be accessible to anybody in your program.
That's brutal, watching myself type and having to hear my own voice. All right, so that's kind of the process, that some of the technical process for going about creating and where I create those lessons. And as I was mentioning, when I'm doing this one on step 2 and 3 on that form, once that assignment has been created and the learning targets being aligned to CCRS, I want to make sure I click on the Google form created by the state to be able to submit that lesson. So once you're going in this, you want to make sure that you've got your lesson kind of outlined, what's going to be covered, what's the main idea of that lesson or the main purpose and targets, and how they align with CCRS, how much time you're going to want to be able to spend, your students to spend on it, and really kind of keeping all those different factors in mind as you are submitting it to the state. The form looks relatively long. However, I have found it, after doing it a couple of times, and again, by having that Google sheet that I created that has the links along with our benchmarks and their connection with CCRS, easily accessible. I can make sure that my routines that are aligned with my benchmarks all are really clearly stated what I need to check as far as how it aligns with CCRS. On the right-hand side, for number 3, this is a form that was created by the lovely distance learning team at Minneapolis Public Schools. And again, it follows much of the same process and a lot of the same information that was submitted to the state. But what this does is creates an ongoing spreadsheet for us at Minneapolis Public Schools to make sure we have all of those links aligned and that it's one more place to house. So by creating those resources or those assessments within the resource folder in Schoology, we can make sure that it's something that other teachers in our program can grab and use for future use. But then we also have this as our other form as backup to make sure, again, we're getting the most bang for our buck when we are creating our TVM lessons, that it'll just get easier and easier throughout the years, hopefully, so that we have a clear idea of how this is aligned to each one of our units and how much time we can expect to use on it. So I'm going to take a breath there for just a moment. This does have, again, an adaptation because I know not every program is using Schoology. As a backup, I know a lot of programs have been using Google Drive to follow the shared, having shared folders in a similar way that the resources do. So this is just a quick tutorial on how you can make sure that these TVM lessons, if you're creating packets or other kind of materials for students, could be shared pretty easily program-wide using Google Drive.
Possible alternative to using Schoology resources to create and share your TVM lessons is simply using your Google Drive account. If you have Google Drive, simply create a shared folder called TVM Lessons, and then begin populating it with the common courses in your program. Once you're in there, find the class. Again, create a folder or add your TVM lessons into already created folders. Name them again according to how you would submit them to the state and to your program. And then simply click New, add it as a Google Doc, slide or form, depending on what you want to use with your students, and follow that same naming protocol. That way, any packets, slideshows that you create for your students' TVM lessons will later be able to be shared with other TVM trained teachers in your program.
So if anybody has any other ideas for other methods or for sharing creating and sharing their TVM lessons, I'd love to hear those now. Again, as an instructional coach, I consider myself an instructional thief at times. If you have other ideas on adaptations that you can do in your program that you have found success with, I'd love to hear those in the chat. Or if you have any other questions about any of the information on those first few slides. All right, I'm going to keep moving through, but again, feel free to enter any information into that chat, questions, comments, ideas, and then we'll check back in again in a little bit. All right. So in creating my TVM lesson, I also wanted to touch in on the components of when I'm actually technically building the lesson and thinking through things for my students. And here are some of the biggest things that I think through is the directions for my students, the lesson or the instructional component, the practice and the assessment. So one of the things that I have found being really beneficial, I'm currently teaching a class in High Flex this year, is finding that having been forced to go online completely quite suddenly was never a good thing in one aspect, but there was some good things that came out of it. So we realized that a lot of the things that we did to adapt for those online classes, specifically around going visual for those directions and making sure that those routines were really strong and in place to make it so that students were able to find success despite the technology demands was really important. So I kind of continued to move through and use that same process as I was coming back in person and then extending it into TVM. So the routines that I use for directions, for the lessons, the practice components, and the assessment, everything that students are seeing in their online classes, I want to make sure they're seeing those same routines being implemented, even if it's a slight modification in person and again in their TVM lessons. So when I'm moving through all of this information, what we're going to see today is how beneficial that can be and what does it actually look like in a TVM lesson and in my in-person class. Another thing that I'm going to discuss a bit as we move into feedback in the next section is that I really view everything that my students are doing in their TVM lesson either instructional or formative assessment. So even though we broke it down as practice and assessment, a lot of the activity that I do in the practice section would still be used formatively and being addressed again back into the classroom. So even though I might only be giving direct feedback on the part that's identified as assessment, that assessment component could be both formative and summative or some variant of that as well. But when I'm looking at the practice, it's almost always something that I can at least reference back to those trends in the class. And the more you reference an acknowledgement of that work in their TVM lessons, the more you tend to see students really kind of finding the value of that because it feels both really personal and it feels like something that's not a standalone lesson. It's not homework. It's really and truly a part of our class. So in this one, I am looking through in part one of like really thinking through the directions in the lesson. And so if we look to the left-hand side of the slide here under directions, You can see at the very top is one of the ways that in student packets and oftentimes presented in the class, the way students would view their learning target and the directions for what they're going to be doing. So these were visuals. Our program invested heavily in doing Envoy training and making sure that we were doing visual exit directions for our students to kind of give them ownership of what to do if they were a little behind on what those directions are. So we wanted to make sure that we could implement that in online classes. I'm using those same visuals as part of a routine in an in-person class. So whether students are online or in person, they're still seeing those same direction components for their class on what they should be able to do. And again, it minimizes transitions and gives some ownership to those students. I have found that to be even more important when we are looking, and that's what you're seeing on the bottom side of the left-hand side of the screen at the bottom is an actual TVM lesson within Schoology where students are being asked to listen to information and respond verbally and record their answers so that I would be able to hear it and assess that for them. So again, we just want to make sure there's consistency in those directions whenever possible. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the way we do the same thing when we are looking at the lesson component or the instruction. At the top part, you see all of my presentations of information are put together in Google Slides, can be downloaded into PowerPoint, but again, easy to save and share with others in our program. So when I'm presenting information in class, I'm using those Google Slides that are moving through. The packets that students usually have are usually a combination of those things and sometimes additional materials. But most of that information is all presented in those slideshows. And so when I'm doing the instructional component of the TVM lesson, I create either screencasts that include myself presenting that information or sometimes just a screencast of the slideshow. So again, that information that they're seeing in class, whether online or in person, the lesson component in TVM looks really similar as well. So they again are seeing those learning targets. And then there's a video that they can watch that is their teacher walking them through the lesson as presented in a slideshow. And again, that familiarity makes them feel more comfortable. And then again, that it's not something really different, but rather it's part of that class. It's just one more lesson in a different platform. The practice and assessment pieces up at the top, you can see a lot of times what I will say is the practice, I try to make it something that can be self-scored or automatically scored so that students can get that feedback more immediately. And then I always try to get something in there that would be the assessment piece that the teacher will give some more individual feedback with. Oftentimes that includes reading out loud, recording something, or having just kind of doing some writing activities would be examples of things where that feedback is going to be a little bit more individualized for the students. So these are just, again, two examples where you can see those visual exit directions with the kind of questions students are able to answer. So using a variety as we would in class, multiple choice, recording. This was up at the top, a reading activity that students did that they had to read. If towards the bottom, sometimes when I want to make it really clear which words I will be assessing and giving feedback on, I will put those in bold or change the color. But again, it really is a lot of the same routines that they're going to see in the classroom, just transitioned over asynchronously. And when students have problems with this, we again, we want to be able to respond in real time whenever possible. So some of my students, if it is during a time when we don't have class, will still send messages and telling me what problems they had with it, because they know then we will be able to address some of the questions and concerns they have when we're back together in class. So that is kind of the process that I use when I am creating those different components of my instruction and the practice and the assessment. Again, some possible adaptations would be, again, if you're building these things in Google Drive packets, having those in your shared folders, but really kind of building those packets, and again, using as much commonality between the in-person classes and those asynchronous lessons as possible. I did play for a while using Nearpod, which I really liked. That was another option. The thing that I liked about that is, again, I could be presenting and using that as a slideshow in my classroom. And then I could also have that done asynchronous. So I was able to model in real time in the classroom what that looked like, and then have students work on opening up those Nearpods, and that lesson feature was already there, along with the ability for them to move through and answer, respond to questions. The other thing I really loved about Nearpod is that they were able to collaborate and work with one another. And that's been a really big challenge with anything online, or especially in TVM where it's asynchronous. So usually they're all alone when they're doing it. And then the same thing with Padlet. Padlet has been another great way for a lot of people when they're working on writing or submitting work at higher levels to be able to share their work with one another and kind of have a collaborative project that they're working on together. So I did see a few comments and ideas coming through. I want to take a moment to look through those, but if you have other suggestions on other methods or ideas, questions that you might have, I'll just take a moment to look through those. So it looks like Amy is using Google spreadsheet for her TVM catalog in her program. Yeah. All right. How do you please use? How often? So in our program in this year, what we have found for the timing is that I have 1 day a week where, in lieu of class, students are working on their TVM lessons. I agree. I do feel like it is relatively elaborate. But again, I have found a lot of the work has been work that has been done. So I feel really privileged this year that I am teaching the same level class that I taught last year, because of when I was teaching online, I already did a lot of the work of creating those slideshows with lessons and questions and practice. So a lot of what I'm doing is trying to maximize that as much as possible. So taking pieces of those lessons and doing screencasts and uploading them. And within Schoology, that's actually a pretty quick and seamless process. And then using the same questions, copying and pasting those over and moving them over. So it hasn't been as bad as it might look there. However, I can see how it does feel really tedious, really hard. And that's where I would just really want to emphasize the idea of making sure that all of those lessons are accessible and shared in the future, because that's a lot of work for somebody to put in. And the last thing you would want to do is those TVM lessons being like, wait, is there something that's already been created that's going to work for this? So keeping them as aligned to the curriculum as possible to try to maximize that work. My students are remote 1 day a week. So they are, the way my class works is I have class Monday through Wednesday in person. I'm doing it high flex actually this year because a lot of my students have been expressing that as a need. So most of my students are present in the classroom Monday through Wednesday and on Friday. On Thursday, in lieu of class, my students are at home working on their TVM lessons. As I expressed earlier, a lot of my students have some needs around technology and a lot of challenges with it, which is why they've chosen an in-person class. So I keep my class open on Thursdays, and the messaging that I tell them is your English practice is all in Schoology, or your English practice is all TVM. But if you need help with the technology pieces, you can come in and meet with me to work on those things. I think the benefit of replacing an in-person day with the TVM day at this point has been that our program is working on and really investing into building TVM for future uses. And so it was allowing our teachers more time without losing a great deal. So we're still able to get more hours with our students and that they're still able to move through, but we're kind of using that time as like paid time for teachers to do some of the building and the feedback process. We're hoping that down the line that will not have to be the case, and that students will be able to get those lessons as an extension of the work that they're doing instead of replacing those days. Yes, Amy. I agree. I think so much of this is, it is a bit of work, but really putting your time and effort into making these lessons quality are going to be really, really important in order to get the buy-in for us to continue to do that. Yeah, Emily, that's a really good question. And again, I would have to defer to our distance learning team. We're really hoping on getting more and more teachers each year trained in on TVM so that we can have more people on deck creating these and using them. So when I am looking at this, I really want to make sure that we're looking at this as an investment in our program. And so we also have some great work done in our curriculum teams, where we've spent a lot of years aligning our benchmarks with CCRS and building and researching more materials. And so again, we have some capacity to kind of transition in the future, the more teachers that are trained in, to use some of that professional development time and collaborative time together to build even more.
So can I ask just sort of a quick follow-up question?
Sure.
So essentially, are you like on your Thursdays, you're in the building, students could choose to come in and get help, especially around technology if they needed it,
Yep.
but you're using that time partially to respond to TVM lessons that have been done by
Yep.
students. And then do you also find you still have time to be creating new lessons?
Most weeks I do.
Okay.
I would say the way my class works, anyone who's had when you're having new students entering in, and we do have some managed enrollment, when we have new students starting up, I find that time to be more diminished. So more and more students are saying, what's this Schoology business? I forgot, how do I access it? How do I record my voice again? And those questions are coming up, but as they continue to use those same routines, it becomes less and less that they're showing up, or sometimes they're showing up for the social component and they don't really want me. And those points I am continuing to work on building or responding. I see the question about the change on May 1st. I'm gonna keep moving, and then I'm hoping maybe somebody else can speak to it a bit more. Again, within Minneapolis Public Schools, we have really approached TVM as the lessons should be asynchronous. And so that change wasn't a drastic departure for us. My understanding is in some programs, they might have been doing that instructional piece in the classroom and building it in so that the practice and the assessment piece was happening outside of the classroom. And the change would be that they are saying they want all of those components within the TVM lesson. I might know as much as you do because I just got the email.
Mara, it looks like Astrid was able to answer that question in the chat.
Great.
And we have 10 minutes left.
All right, I'm gonna go fast then. So the last couple parts is tracking the completion and the attendance. So when I am really looking at students completing their work, I want to make sure that I'm monitoring it, and Schoology does help me with that, both with so that I can make sure that I'm taking the students' attendance and that I can provide those students with the feedback they need. So I don't know that people need a lot of time with modeling how to take attendance, but I'll kind of move through this process. This is my Schoology gradebook. So once I've created an assessment and assigned it to my students, as they are at home working, I'm able to kind of monitor who has got it completed. So I'm sorry, if it comes in and it says needs grading, that means that it is requiring me to go through and manually check some of the work that students have done in order for it to be completed. So in this one, you can see in progress means a student has started it but not finished it. In the needs grading, that means that I have a responsibility to go in and check that student's work before it's completed. And the ones that are green and marked completed means that I've had a chance to provide that feedback to those students. The feedback that I give that is on my TVM lessons can both be automatic and personalized. So when I'm looking through this one, if you look at the top one is an example of students listening to a word and writing in the identified sounds that they heard. I have Schoology set up in that one so that it is automatic. If they typed in the correct answer, that they would get that immediate feedback once they submit it. If there was like a mistake, like there was a formatting issue, I can always go in and override that. But I can also have the option underneath where it says add feedback to be able to add the feedback to students. And when I click on add feedback, what you see is what is in the bottom right-hand corner, where there is, you can do it via text, image, audio, or video. So again, a lot of the things that I do in my classroom for my students, because they're lower level, is making sure that they're getting multiple forms of feedback, both written and video. I don't always like having my face on there, but students really do appreciate it if they submit work. If you can see up on the top right is what the feedback looks like when I record myself in a video talking to the students about what they want to, what they should be working on or what they did really well. That's where I make sure I'm giving feedback on that assessment component. I can also do, as you're seeing on the bottom left, is be able to see what it looks like from the student view when I give feedback via writing. So either way, it shows up with my image that I'm telling them something when they go back and check their own work. And again, the last piece that I have is really looking at how I use that gradebook. For the final step in my process is making sure that I'm taking my students' work, if they have completed all of that work, and we've moved through that entire process of making sure that they are getting their attendance and their credit for it. So when they do that one, I have to keep in mind how many minutes I designated that activity for. And then I look through in this gradebook of who has completed it, and enter that information on. I have an attendance form that I enter into SID, and I enter onto my own spreadsheet so that I can kind of keep track of it. And again, because this year has been a pilot year, I keep tracking how much time students are really spending on it. There was a couple of assignments that I originally submitted to the state as being maybe 30 minutes, and then students were spending an hour plus on it. And I've had a couple that have gone the other way. So I'm trying to keep it as accurate as possible so that teachers coming in and teaching this level in the future would be able to grab it and use it as needed. Some of the adaptations that I've seen for tracking that attendance is having paper hard copies, or just tracking that information of who's completed on a class list. I know in our program, we always enter our information into SID, but we also really want to make sure that we have some backup forms so that we can prove that that our hours are matching in case we were to get audited. But another thing that we've talked through is possibly just printing the grading page that has those students' information and connecting it with our SID list, or tracking on other Google platforms. So some people are using Google Documents versus the spreadsheet. So on that last part of tracking completion and feedback, I'm gonna jump back in and see, we've got, looks like a couple of minutes if there's other questions or comments or ideas on how people have done things differently. How would you be able to record the assessment in the Google Drive option? Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the thing that I really like about things like Schoology is being able to have that as automatic. If anyone has any other really great ideas on that one.
Well, if I could say, sorry, we do, and this was very helpful, thank you. We haven't started doing TVM yet, but we'd like to. I teach a college readiness class at the International Institute, and we do use Google Classroom. So after I wrote that comment, I was thinking Google Classroom can also track grades. So we could either do a topic that's TVM only, or we could do a separate classroom that's TVM maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. And Abby, I 100% agree with yours too, is sometimes the low tech, no tech options. We have been really investing this year in building these things in Schoology and using them. I know a lot of people are using those paper packets. And one of the things that I have said is that I really believe that consistency from one class, from your in-person class to those TVM lessons is the key. So for me, even when I'm presenting in my classroom, whatever Google Slides presentation I have, generally the packet that students are receiving is that same Google slideshow, just with 2 slides per sheet. And so I could say very easily a lot of the same pieces of information that I'm moving over from those slideshows into Schoology for TVM could easily be transferred over with possibly just a little bit more explanation into the instructional piece, so that you're getting the visual and then maybe a bit more of an explanation if there's something that would be helpful. And then, you know, again, that one is more of the automatic scoring versus the manual. It would be all much more personalized to move through if students are completing it. But if people have other ideas, like I said, I mean, that's kind of the limit of this presentation, is this year's our first year with TVM. We've been really focused in Schoology. Elizabeth Bennett is on it though. I like that.
The only other question I'm seeing that maybe you haven't addressed was, could you go into more detail or review about how you structure your instruction piece?
My instruction piece. Yeah. So the way I do that one is usually by, again, taking a slideshow that looks very similar to what I would be doing in an in-person class. But when I'm all by my lonesome, I just have that slideshow up. And then I do a screencast of myself teaching that lesson the same as I would if I were in the classroom, except for I don't have an audience. And then I embed that video into Schoology so that students get that watch feature. And that's what they're going to go back and watch. And sometimes there's 2 small pieces and sometimes it's just 1 lesson.
All right, looks like we're at time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Mara. That was a wonderful presentation, very, very informative. And thanks everyone for being here. Rob just chatted out the link to the flyer, which has a link to the evaluation, which is what you can fill out in order to get your CEUs. So maybe Rob, you could chat that out one more time. I'll go ahead and stop the recording. Thanks so much for being here, everyone.
Thank you.